will now move to the motion before the House this evening, which is, this House supports the deal. I now look to the first speaker, Amber Seaward, Chief of Staff, Magdalen College, to open the case for the proposition.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First off, I'd like to thank the President for hosting such a historical debate and for allowing me the opportunity to speak in it. So, on the 24th of June 2016, 51.9% of people voted to leave the European Union. 2.5 years later, Theresa May has presented us with a deal detailing the terms of our departure. Now, 3 weeks before we are due to leave, the decision facing the members of Parliament and the decision before us here tonight is whether to support this deal and move forward from the democratic decision with stability, or whether to continue the chaotic and divisive negotiations that we have seen over the past few years. I don't intend to convince you tonight that this deal is in any way perfect on ideological terms. I'm lucky enough to have Henry Newman and Rory Stewart, the Tory government minister, on my side tonight, and I'll gladly leave the defence of the deal and its intricacies to them. What I do intend to convince you is that we need to support a deal on practical terms alone. My argument will be based around 3 points. Firstly, in the midst of this unprecedented political turmoil, we need a stable decision to take us forward. Secondly, no deal outcome is not desirable, and we need to avoid this at all costs by supporting the deal. Finally, it is both too late and undemocratic to have a second referendum at this point. There is a deal right in front of us now, and we need to take it to stop the chaos continuing. But before I launch into my argument, it is my pleasure to introduce the opposition speakers in tonight's debate. First up, we have James Dix, a second-year law student at Christ Church and chair of the Consultative Committee of the Oxford Union. When I was talking to James yesterday about how his speech was coming on, he said that every time he sat down to write it and researched anything on Brexit, he became more and more convinced that actually we do need to be supporting the government's deal. So I imagine that anything we hear from him tonight will be disguising his true feelings on the matter. Next up, we have Lord Adonis, a Labour Party politician and the face of the push for a second referendum. In a time where many Labour MPs are resigning from the party, Lord Adonis has stuck by Corbyn and his Labour Party. Now, given that a few weeks ago when he spoke here, he endorsed the losing presidential candidate in our recent elections, I might consider he reconsiders his loyalty. Next up, we have Dominic Brind, a dedicated deputy returning officer here at the Union and head of research at Our Future, Our Choice, which is a pro-EU campaign group. As a good friend of Dom's, I can personally testify that his character is literally defined by his love of the EU. If you have not seen his profile picture on Facebook, it is him celebrating the end of his exams with an EU flag. However, if the Ramonas want to get rid of their reputation of being the liberal metropolitan elite of Westminster, they might consider a new ambassador. Last, but by no means least, we have Nigel Farage. He really needs no introduction. He is a former leader of UKIP and the face of the Leave campaign. While he's divided opinion, I'm sure we can all agree tonight that he is probably the one who's got us into this mess. And it's interesting to hear his thoughts on how we can get out of it. Having Nigel Farage and Lord Adonis speaking on the same side tonight might seem surprising. The two famously disagree on everything when it comes to Brexit, bar their apparent hatred of May's deal. And this speaks volumes of the current political situation that we're in. I can only hope that they'll argue more with each other tonight than they do with the proposition. Mr. President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. So, to begin, in accepting May's deal, we would be providing a much-needed boost of stability to the UK economy. It is ridiculous that 3 weeks before we leave, we do not know what we're going to wake up to on the 30th of March. Ever since the Brexit vote, no one has quite known what has been priced into the market. This has been the biggest source of uncertainty since the financial crisis, has dampened economic growth, and has partially led to firms like Honda relocating, causing the losses of over 3,000 jobs. Economists at the Financial Times estimate that Brexit has already cost the UK between 1.5 and 2.5% of GDP, and it hasn't even happened yet. The only way to prevent uncertainty is to reach a conclusive decision. If we agree on a deal and its terms, the markets will know what to expect. This will symbolically reflect the UK and the government going forward with certainty and unity. Accepting almost any deal in this point would be ideal in the interest of stability and would allow us to move forward from the issue of Brexit and to refocus our attention on neglected issues like knife crime, the NHS, and the housing crisis. Moving on to my second point, the reason to favour this deal in particular is that there is simply no feasible alternative. There is no majority for a no deal, for extending Article 50, or for a second referendum. In January, the Spellman Amendment passed, showing there is a majority against a no-deal outcome. At the same time, the Cooper Amendment, detailing a 9-month extension to Article 50, failed thanks to Labour rebels. No, thank you. Even if these were politically feasible and did have a majority, they are not the desirable option. May's deal is the least worst option, as I will now go on to explain. Let's first discuss a no deal. As Emily Thornberry once said, standing in this very spot, that very spot actually, a no deal outcome for Britain would be an unmitigated disaster. Mark Carney has continually warned of the economic shocks from a no deal and no transition exit. Our historical political relationship with the EU would break down immediately. We would lose the transition period that we need to make deals with other countries. It would show that after 2.5 years, the UK government has not been competent enough to come up with literally any agreement with the EU. Hardline Brexiteers may advertise this option as a way to totally sever ties with the EU and to ensure that we give them no money or control. But let's take a moment to imagine the world that we'd wake up to on the 30th of March under WTO terms. The exchange rate and financial markets would plummet. We would be subjected to EU tariffs. We have even read reports that we would literally run out of food and medicine. We could see empty shelves in the supermarkets. A poll of the members of the Institute of Directors found that 29% of firms are considering partially relocating their firms to the EU. That's almost 1/3 of businesses that want to get out. And a report published by Don Brind himself for Our Future, Our Choice said that millennials could lose up to £108,000 in career earnings from a worst outcome no-deal Brexit. This is 10 times as much as what could be lost under a Norway-style exit, where we remain part of the European Economic Area. We are coming dangerously close to this no-deal being the outcome. The Spellman Amendment that I mentioned earlier passed by a very slim majority of only 8 votes. We can clearly see that this is not the desirable outcome, and we need to avoid it at all costs by supporting the deal. The other option, of course, is a second referendum. Of course, this question of the people's vote could take up the basis of an entire debate by itself, so I will briefly outline the reasons why at this stage it is both impossible and undesirable. Firstly, it is simply too late. We are 3 weeks from when we're supposed to leave the EU. For context, it took 7 months for the legislation to be passed for the 2016 Brexit referendum, plus a minimum of 12 weeks for the Electoral Commission to test the question, plus however long is needed in campaign time. It is simply impossible to have this referendum without a significant extension of the Article 50 deadline. And this is not as easy as it seems. As already mentioned, there is not a majority for this extension in Parliament. Even if there was, it would require the EU's agreement, and they are unlikely to grant us more than about 3 months due to the European Parliament elections in May. This is hardly enough time to renegotiate a deal or enough time to have a second referendum. Secondly, there is really no clarity on what a second referendum would even look like. What would be on the ballot paper? I assume that its major proponents, like Lord Adonis, would insist that Remain was on the cards. But if it was, this is undoubtedly reneging on the democratic decision that was made in 2016. The decision of whether to leave or remain has already been put to the people, and a conclusive outcome has already been made. You do not have to be a Brexiteer, and I certainly am not one, to be a Democrat and to understand that the will of the people must be respected in this circumstance. Representative democracy is built around us electing politicians to decide policy for us. And in this example, we were even allowed to inform the decision in the first place. In 2015, we elected David Cameron on the promise of getting a Brexit referendum. In 2016, we decisively decided to leave. And in 2017, we re-elected Theresa May on the promise of her seeing her deal through. No, thank you. A second referendum would be undemocratic, would delay negotiations, and would risk another few years of a divided country, whatever the outcome may be. So, both a second referendum and a no-deal outcome ought to be avoided. Even if they seem preferable to you, there is simply no majority for them in Parliament. There is simply no feasible alternative to this deal. If this is not reason enough for you to support the proposition tonight, let me touch on one final thing before I wrap up. This deal does actually strike a compromise between two sides of a divided country. The EU question has split the Cabinet, Parliament, and the nation as a whole right down the middle, and so has the deal, in receiving criticism from Leave and Remain in equal measure. The opposition might tell you how awful the deal is, but I'd like to remind you that they're coming at this from very different angles. I'd like to suggest that this deal is actually quite representative of a divided nation if both sides hate it equally for being too like the other. Indeed, it can be seen as the perfect compromise. For Brexiteers, there must be some concessions given to the other half of the country who did not want to leave in the first place. For them, the deal is a way to avoid a second referendum. For Remoaners like myself, we have to accept that we are leaving the EU. While the opposition might insist that if we reject the deal, we are not certainly guaranteeing a no-deal outcome, this is far too big a risk to take. We need to support the deal in a way to prevent the no-deal cliff edge. So, to summarise, the country has decided to leave, and either prolonging the interim period with a second referendum or falling off the cliff edge without a deal are both undesirable and impossible without a majority. It does not matter that the deal is not perfect. It is the only one we have on the table. So, I know that I have not been particularly dramatic or entertaining in this speech so far, which is unideal when you're up against Mr. Populism Nigel Farage and the hero of the Remainers, Lord Adonis. However, what I'm trying to say is sensible. When you walk out that door, you're deciding whether to continue the political chaos that we are currently in, or to make a firm decision and unite the country around a clear path for the future. That is why I'm urging you to vote with the proposition tonight. Thank you.